the geopolitical impact of COVID-19 on the Middle East. In the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, as you know, the think tank of the European People's Party. And this is part of our series, Thinking Europe, Our Common House, or the hashtag is Stay Home, Stay Informed. So large portions of the Middle East have been devastated by years of conflict, huge economic imbalances, up to economic collapse, multiple humanitarian crises. To think only of the wars in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and of course the Israeli-Arab conflict. In fact, the Middle East itself has become a source of instability elsewhere. Think of terrorism or uncontrolled mass migration. On the other hand, there were always signs of hope. So, for example, during the Arab Spring almost 10 years ago, or in the democracy movements in countries like Iran more recently. Now, this fragile situation is hit by the virus. So, what could be the result? How are displaced populations and failed states affected by this? Are there potential opportunities? For example, for cooperation, providing aid, or encouraging dialogue between the EU and the countries of the Middle Eastern region. And what are the fault lines on this within the West, in transatlantic relations, for example? So in order to debate these questions, my two guest speakers are Sabah Farzan, a German-Iranian journalist in Berlin. She has written for major publications like the Wall Street Journal Europe, the Jerusalem Post, Die Zeit, the Tagesspiegel, Die Welt, as well as Neue Zürcher Zeitung, and these are just a few of them. Michael Benamou has been a policy analyst for 10 years, focusing on conflict, migration, and discrimination. As a visiting fellow with us at the Martens Center, he produced a study on the EU strategy in Syria in 2016. Today, he is the founder of Aaron Praxis, a Brussels-based data analytics consultancy, which can be applied to public policy. And he has worked in Kuwait, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Lebanon, and more recently for an EU mission in Libya. And here are some housekeeping remarks. As you know, this event is, As you know, this event is live streamed. You can use the comments section to leave your comments and questions, and please be concise. So, having done the introduction, first turning to Michael Benamou. What's the impact of COVID-19 on the Middle East? Over to you.
First of all, thanks, Roland, for inviting me. Always a pleasure to be with you and the Martens Center, and today with Sabah. As you said, I'm doing data analytics a lot with my business, and so I did this for our conference, and so I tried to understand first what was the demographic impact, then the economic impact, and then the policy one. I will be as brief as possible, I promise to you. When we look at the numbers, the health numbers, we see that there is 10 times less COVID-related death in the Middle East than in Europe. In the Middle East right now, the Middle East meaning North Africa plus the Near East plus Turkey and Iran. In this broad region, which is equivalent in terms of population to Europe, there is 10,000 people that sadly died with the coronavirus, against 10 times this for Europe. So when you look at this number, you might think that the situation is much better, and you might explain it by the fact that the population in the Middle East is much, much younger than in Europe. 8% in the Middle East are above 60 years old, against 28% in Europe. But the reality, Roland, and this is my belief, is that, and this is the belief of many people who work on this, is that the data coming from the Middle East is actually very flawed. Because we have two broad situations in this region. We have either civil wars, or we have authoritarian regimes. And in both cases, it is very difficult to actually collect the right kind of data. But probably Saba will discuss it in more specifics. So the data is flawed, and we know, thanks to the World Bank, that health capacities and, for example, number of beds in hospitals is not what it is in other parts of the world. For example, in the Middle East, you have 20 beds per 10,000 people on average, 20 beds per 10,000 against 50 beds in Europe. So this is for health. With regards to economics, the impact, I think, is you can measure the impact in 4 ways. The first one being the absence, the fall of remittances, the funds which are being sent, for example, from Europe or from Germany to the Middle East. Of course, these funds have dried up. Number 2, tourism. Of course, tourism is falling, and this is hitting regions like countries like Morocco, Tunisia, or Egypt. 3, cereal imports. We often forget it, Roland and Saba, but this region, the Middle East, is not self-sufficient like we are in Europe, in most parts of Europe. So they rely on imports of food, which right now are increasingly difficult. And 4th, and this is the most obvious, the fall of the oil price. The crude oil is at $13. And it was supposed to be at 60 and 70. And this is hitting countries like Algeria or Iran very hard because they rely on this for their fiscal balance. And now finally, Roland, going to the policy impact, we see that with this crisis, we see that the Americans are less and less engaging in this region. Security aid and development aid remains stable, but the number of soldiers is falling. There were 40,000 troops under Obama. There is now 15,000 troops under Trump in the Middle East. And on the other side, we see a Europe which is engaging with a lot of funds. No new funds. I've looked at the numbers too, but there's a serious reallocation of funds from the Near East, so from the Eastern Med to the Western Med, which is North Africa. This is, for me, the major conclusion that I see coming out of Brussels these days. So an increased flexibility of EU tools, but as you know, these tools are always frustrating because there is a lack of military component to it, and so an inability to actually to have any leverage in crises such as Syria or Libya. And we can discuss this in more details if you want. So a European activism in the face of this crisis, especially in a country like Morocco or Tunisia or Jordan. And so I think we should support that. But there is still an inability from European capitals to actually engage meaningfully to shape the future of this region in partnership with this region, of course. So that would be my introduction, Roland, to this debate.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Before turning to Saba, I just have one more follow-up question to you. You talk about the increasing opportunity for Europe.
Yes.
Maybe in future also the increasing ability of Europe to actually build a stronger position in the Middle East. Maybe this is accelerated by the corona crisis, but I would take the opposite view. I would actually say it's going to be more difficult for Europe to play that role in the Middle East, simply because economically speaking, we will be struggling ourselves. So I don't see us ponying up and actually producing even the economic instruments to really increase our profile. And in that situation, how can we get better on military? You tell me, Michael.
This is a great take. On the military, I think obviously the budgets, it's likely that the budgets will be cut down, and that would be unfortunate. And as often in this discussion, we expect northern European countries and Germany to do more. So we'll have to see if, well, these countries are going to use this COVID crisis as a new excuse to not build up this military apparel. With regards to the economic tools, yeah, I think we have to, as we say, think out of the box, which is a horrible phrase, often used. But what you could imagine is for example, bringing businessmen from Europe to engage in the Middle East, Roland, in the part of a post-COVID Mediterranean forum, for instance. I see opportunities for companies to bring back their production lines closer to Europe. So bring them back from Asia closer to our core, to our Schengen core, in places like the Balkans, like Turkey, and in countries in the Middle East which have a high business ranking, World Bank ranking, such as Jordan, Tunisia, and Morocco. So these countries have been making efforts, and I think that at a rather cheap price, we could bring back some of these production lines to them. So this would be a concrete way to come up with solutions after this crisis that would make sense. I think that would make sense politically. I think there is a large chunk of the European electorate which would understand that, which would understand such a geographic shift. And to conclude on this, I would say that in Europe, we have to think regional more than global. We have to stop spreading our attention and funds across the world. I see, Roland, that 6% of the EU budget is still spent in Latin America, and 8% of our development budget is still spent in Asia, which doesn't need this anymore. So I think we should try to refocus on our region and therefore stabilize it.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Turning over to you, Saba. Now, what's the situation in Iran?
First of all, Roland, it's an honor to be with you and Michael and the Martens Center. We have to focus, sadly now, on a dire situation inside Iran. And it really makes a difference if a country is a democracy or a dictatorship. And Iran has been hardest hit by the corona outbreak. And it's been a problem that has been caused by the Iranian regime mostly. There are a variety of reasons for that. So at a time when Europeans and the Americans stopped commercial flights to China, Iran continued travel to China. That exposed the Iranian people to more vulnerability. The Iranian regime refused to start a lockdown for a very long time. It has now eased a lot of the measures of a lockdown, again exposing the Iranian people to more dangers. And Iran has been hit by the corona crisis after it has already been through a lot of challenging situations. There has been a powerful protest movement in November because the regime has risen food prices. Then there was the downing by the Revolutionary Guards of an Ukrainian civilian airliner, killing more than 170 Iranian people. And then again, an outbreak of protest because of that, people expressing their really frustration, their anger, their disagreement with the Iranian regime. And so this is yet another tragic situation that has exposed the Iranian nation to a regime that is run by mismanagement and corruption.
Great. Thank you, Saba. Follow-up question to you. You said Iran has faced challenging situations. Indeed. One of the challenges to the regime in Iran, of course, are the sanctions. The international sanctions, because of certain violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but also the particular US sanctions against Iran, in contrast to Europe. So wouldn't you say that this has made the Iranian situation even more challenging and even more difficult?
Well, it's important that you're raising this aspect because the toughest sanctions regime we have ever seen in international relations has been carried out in the case of Iran because of a clandestine nuclear weapons program, because of terrorism, because of human rights violations. But two aspects have always been excluded from that sanctions regime. One was sort of food, and the other one was medical supplies and medical products. And it has been the Iranian regime that has always denied this aspect. The Iranians have said it that they don't want in this crisis situation any kind of help from the United States. The Americans were ready to support Iran. It has been declined, and a number of some of my esteemed colleagues and friends have really made it publicly and openly clear now is not the time to lift sanctions on Iran. It's actually the time to continue the sanctions regime so that the oppressors of the Iranian people have to be held accountable for what they're doing.
Thank you, Saba. Let me just continue to play devil's advocate here a little bit and just say, look, I mean, this policy of maximum pressure on Iran has not worked. It will not work. It's just driving Iran into a corner, and it actually strengthens the hardliners instead of the moderates, who some EU politicians and leaders consider our best friends in Iran.
Well, because I'm joining you from Berlin, let me quote someone who is very well known in a former German dictatorship, the former GDR, Walter Ulbricht, who was a prominent figure in that socialist dictatorship. And he once said that it has to look democratic, but we have to call the shots at the end of the day. And this is exactly the Iranian political system. It looks a little bit democratic on the surface, but at the end of the day, some people call it an Islamic Vatican, where a religious leadership and a paramilitary leadership is calling the shots. And so that is one aspect. And the other aspect is if someone comes to me and tells me, listen, I am 5% less fascist than the other guys, I don't consider this material that I can work with. So the goal is to be 100% non-fascist. And the Iranian civil society really captures that in its secular, democratic, open-minded approach to the world. They are living European values every day, but they're doing this hidden in their living rooms. And these are the partners that we have to strengthen and not fall into into sort of the belief into this fake news approach that there are different factions within the Iranian dictatorship, because at the end of the day, they're all the same.
Thanks, Sava. Just to finish this point, there's a great quote from Joseph Stalin, allegedly, who said that, elections are decided not by the people who vote, but by the people who count the votes. So having said this, I've got two questions already, and let me turn to Michael for
yes.
So we've got a Danish colleague who said, wouldn't it be unfair to classify the United Arab Emirates and Qatar in the same pot as countries such as Iraq and Syria, especially when it comes to public health infrastructure and COVID-19? And well, let's stick with that question and then take the next.
It's a very specific question. I think it's from Gerrit. I have published a couple of maps on Twitter, which you can find also on the Facebook comments. And actually, one of the maps answers Gerrit's precise question. I have, unfortunately, a personal experience of hospitals in the Gulf region, and the quality of health in that area is absolutely remarkable and cannot be compared to any in a region. I mean, I have a couple of numbers right here, but in terms of whether you look at health indexes or number of hospital beds, there's no comparison with a country like Iraq or Syria. No, I think the problem is lies more in the capacity of certain countries, especially North Africa, to cope with this crisis. I think this is my number one, I would say my number one geographic insight, which is that a couple of years ago, Roland, when we thought about the Middle East, we had this Syria-Turkey focus because there was a war in Syria and because there were refugees and asylum seekers there. But now it's the whole region that we have to engage, from Iran to Morocco. Everything is in play in some sense, and everything is important now. So we're in a completely new cycle. I would say, a bit sadly, a post-Syria war cycle, in which we have to think about all regions with new new approach, new solutions, and new partnerships. That would be my number one take from this.
Okay, thanks, Michael. We've got another question here from Ohan in the comment section, who is saying that Asia and Latin America are no longer in need of development aid. Is that what you're trying to say? Or they're no longer strategic in terms of receiving European assistance? So, if you want to increase Europe's footprint in the Middle East, yeah, aren't you going to lower it somewhere else?
I think it is about being more strategic and aligning our funds, our increasingly limited resources, to what the voters want and what they say in ballot boxes. And yes, basically, we have every 6-7 years, there is 100 billion euro pot for foreign spending. So this is the 100 billion euros every cycle, every MFF cycle, as we say in Brussels. It's a huge sum of money, huge. And there's two things we could do with it. We could, yes, reinforce our projects, our programs in our neighborhood, in our direct neighborhood, whether in the east, Ukraine, Georgia, or in the south, in North Africa, Libya, or the Near East. So this is one thing we could do. And I think that we have been doing over the past 10 years. There's been a lot of change in that regard. And the second thing we should do more is better coordination between the military tools with trade and with development projects. And this is something we have not been really good at. And I think this is what Joseph Borrell, the new European diplomat chief, wants to achieve. He's trying to bring everybody around the same flag and to concentrate on key issues. And this is what this crisis has showed. There is, I have to say, I'm always transparent about what I feel about the EU. And I have to say, I was a bit surprised how fast Borrell was able to shift 1 billion euros from the Eastern Med to the Western Med. I mean, not 1 billion, but a large chunk of this 1 billion was transferred in a matter of weeks. This is something that Europe was not able to do before, and that Joseph Borrell has been delivering. So I think whether it is about pushing for the neighborhood or better coordination, I think we're getting there, but we should do more.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Michael. One last question to you, and then I have a couple for Saba. From Gerrit, actually. Could you please elaborate on different levels of financial management by the EU in the Gulf region? Is this impacted by the vacuum the US creates in engaging more in the Asia-Pacific region? So what's your short answer on this, please?
Short of... Clearly, there's a disengagement of the US, whether it is a naval disengagement or land disengagement, for reasons that I think we know, because the US do not rely on oil anymore, because Donald Trump is pushing everybody back home. So far, there's been an effect on the ground, which is an increased amount of Iranian harassment in the Strait of Hormuz. But I think Saba is better qualified than I am to discuss this. So maybe I should let this one to Saba. So there's to my knowledge, there is more harassment in these very strategic hotspots, but nothing more. What I know from having worked over there is that there is a lot of nervosity, a lot of tension, whether it is Qatar, Abu Dhabi or Kuwait even. We don't think about Kuwait enough, but they're in the area. And they're tense, they're seeking military partnerships. They are getting increased military partnership from Europe. There's now an EU naval mission. It's not an EU flag, but there's a European cooperation towards increased naval support in the Strait of Hormuz. So this is very good. But in terms of mass, obviously, Roland, Europe is not able to replace the sums and the number of soldiers that the US is able to deploy, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Now, Saba, there is another Middle Eastern country that we haven't mentioned at all so far, and that's Israel. Israel was one of the first countries to actually enact a very strong lockdown in its own country and react very strongly to the coronavirus pandemic. So what does that tell us? And what else can you say? How does this crisis possibly impact the Israeli-Palestinian situation?
Well, it's absolutely right that the Israelis addressed this crisis situation head on. Their lockdown measures are much, much heavier than ours in Europe, even heavier than the one the Austrians implemented. They have succeeded in keeping the victims actually of the corona virus on a very low scale. I mean, every life is precious, but so far a little bit more than 200 Israelis have sadly lost their lives. And they have also been able to, sort of put every of their measures to a parliamentarian vote, seeking that democratic legitimacy. And it really sort of brought a dynamic where, completely opposite political parties were able to build a coalition and join a government. On the issue of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it remains to be seen what kind of an impact it will have. I am sort of a believer that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as unpleasant as it is for both sides, is not a global conflict. It's a regional one. And unlike the issues that we have with the Iranian regime and the global dimension of all of the activities of the Iranians, the Middle East conflict is one that has been going on for decades, but it's not going to have a global impact. It's not even going to have a geopolitical impact because the Arab countries have moved on from this conflict, and they share together with the Israelis a common, very serious concern about the Iranian dictatorship.
Okay, great. Yes, indeed, maybe the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is overrated. All right, let's move on to maybe transatlantic relations here, because we were talking about Iran, we were talking about sanctions against the Iranian regime and so on, but we haven't really fully discussed the potential widening policy gap between the Europeans vis-a-vis Iran and the United States. I mean, how do you see things developing there?
I wish I could say that Europe is going to change and transform into overcoming this wide gap, this political divide. But the truth is that this great divide between the Americans and the Europeans has been there already for a very long time, and it's a little bit ironic, but I'm going to actually praise and quote an American administration where I have absolutely no love lost for them, the Barack Obama administration. And I remember a time when Obama's national security advisor, Tom Donilon, wrote an op-ed for the New York Times advocating for Europe to classify Hezbollah as a terrorist organization. And the Europeans picked up the New York Times, read the article, put it aside, and continued to treat Hezbollah as a legitimate partner in Lebanon and the Middle East because they were too afraid, we are too afraid of actually leading on these issues that are happening in our backyard, in our direct neighborhood, and that are having a huge impact on our own security. So that divide already happened during the Obama administration. It intensified, of course, during the Trump administration. It has a lot to do with the rhetoric Donald Trump himself uses, but there was really sort of a pushback from the European side on this because Iran is a prestige project of the European Union. It is the only major conflict that the European Union has taken leadership outside of the United Nations. we all remember 3 European foreign ministers traveling to Iran, trying to negotiate a diplomatic solution here. And all of the European measures with regard to Iran on trade, on security issues, on human rights issues, all of these measures have failed and have made the situation even worse. And Europe is unfortunately not ready yet to admit this to itself.
Thanks a lot, Saba. I've got one last question from our audience here in this context of Iran, United Nations, which you mentioned, and Corona, the Corona pandemic. And that is from Ela Slim. Saba, you're saying the sanctions regime against Iran should continue for sanctioned people to be held accountable for their actions. Does this mean you do not support the UN call for easing the sanctions and facilitate the humanitarian aid and equipment delivery to Iran in times of COVID-19? And that's more like, I think she wants a precision from you of something you said generally before.
Right. As hard as that might sound, I am not in favor of easing sanctions. And let me give you a specific example. Within the Iranian system, there has been a fund of roughly 4 billion US dollars that the government of Rouhani, not a moderate in my view, was using to bring humanitarian goods to Iran. So the payment was made, but the Revolutionary Guards imported luxury goods. And as long as we have this situation of corruption and mismanagement, and where this infighting within the Iranian system is happening, now is not the time to ease any kind of sanctions. It is possible to help the Iranian people without helping the Iranian regime.
Thank you, Saba. Now, let me just briefly turn to Mikhail. Mikhail, I saw you were shaking your head slightly when Saba was describing the European Iran policy, but we don't have to. You can say a sentence about this, and then there is another question more generally about the Middle East, and from Fia Long, actually. Do you believe the virus could have any impact on Iran's influence on Iraq and the overall stability in the Middle East? If the state's authority dissolves further, a power struggle could emerge between domestic militia groups and foreign powers. Do you see any further political destabilization here between Iraq and Iran?
Roland, I would not be qualified enough for this one, so maybe I should let Saba answer this question, because she knows this more than me.
Saba, go ahead.
What do you think?
Well, I mean, because we don't have a lot of time, I mean, Iran has effectively become an occupier of Iraq and of Syria as well. And so this is a concern for all of us. It's an immediate concern for the neighboring Arab countries. Let me maybe try to answer this in a specific way, what goal the Iranian regime has. The goal ultimately is spreading the Islamic revolution to other countries. Iran is a Shia Muslim revolutionary regime, and so their ultimate goal is converting sort of the rest of the Muslim population in the Middle East to their Shia revolutionary ideological belief. We can't have that, because this is denying sovereign countries and sovereign people their future, and this is the major challenge, and this is the major problem that we're facing. It's about the nature of the Iranian regime, and it's about the activities that go along with that nature.
Thanks a lot, Saba. Now, last question goes to Michael. Our
Yes.
colleague Gavin is actually asking you to be more precise on the oil price question. You already mentioned that briefly before. The oil price has fallen to fantastically low levels. What, I mean, of course, as a result of the economic side effects of the corona pandemic. Now, what is the political fallout, economic and political fallout?
This is an important one. So the expectation before the crisis was an oil price at $65. Now it fell at 10, and now it rose again at 12, 13 yesterday. This has a huge impact because a lot of regimes or countries in the Middle East are reliant on this for their spendings, and notably for their social spendings. Especially a country like Algeria, Iran is especially exposed. They're exposed even more than the Gulf or Saudi Arabia because they have more debt already. And because they don't have any alternatives to producing oil and exporting it, and so the crisis is going to be extremely heavy for these countries. Saudi Arabia a bit less because, and also Gulf countries, GCC countries, because they're able to raise funds on markets very easily. So Saudi Arabia could raise 50, 60 billion dollars to cover their debts if the oil price continues to remain this low. So they can survive this crisis. The regime can survive this crisis for many, many months. This might not be the case for Algeria or for Iran also, which Iran needs an oil barrel at $200, close to $200, to have a balanced budget. And obviously at $10, they will not make the cut. Which is why the Iranians are doing everything they can to resupply China, and they hope for a China economic revival, and a fast one. Because if it is not fast, the regime might be endangered, seriously endangered, because it will not be able to spend what it was spending before, and it will probably not be able to raise vast sums of money on markets for legal and financial reasons. Okay. And so the stakes are high. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're running a little bit out of time, but there's space for just one more question from Martens Center Executive Director Tommy Huchtanen. How is the Turkey-Russia relationship evolving, and how is the development impacting the region? And that probably also goes to you, Michael.
It's still love and hate, but in the case of Syria, a deal was formed, which is more or less respected, and which is holding right now in the north of Syria. But definitely, what I see is that these two countries are playing. They're back at. In politics, and they are playing the political game, and the military want to, and we are not. As Europeans, we are out of. We're completely out in the cold with regards to these conflicts, and we have to wait. Now we have to wait and see what these countries decide, and at the end, often pay the bill in terms of migration crisis and then development projects. So how long is Europe going to accept this role of caretaker and not of a policymaker? This is a trend that is going to continue if we do not take military tools seriously. And if we don't understand that as Europeans, we have enemies, Roland, this is a sad thing to say, but there are people who are pushing against our own interests, and we have to fight back.
Indeed, I think this realistic and sober, but also far-sighted note is the right point to finish on. Let me just formulate maybe the three broad takeaways very selectively from this debate on the geopolitical impact of the COVID-19 on the Middle East. First of all, a situation which has always been challenging got even more challenging. I think there's consensus on this through the corona pandemic. Second, there certainly is room for improvement, and there is a possibility for improvement of Europe trying to enlarge its footprint, even in this challenging situation. It takes more ambition, it will take resources, and it will take thinking outside the box, and mobilizing business, mobilizing civil society, definitely thinking more strategically. And the third point is that, having said all this, there are power conflicts in the Middle East and religious and ideological strife in the Middle East which are just not going away, whatever outside powers may do. And one of these, of course, is the export of instability and actually of terrorism by the Iranian regime. I think this is one of the major lasting security challenges in the Middle East. So Saba, Michael, thank you so much for having been with us and shared your wisdom. Thank you all for having listened and actively participated with asking questions and making comments. And stay at home, stay informed. Bye-bye.
Stay safe.
Good luck.